Welcome, everyone. My name's Lori Schreier. I'm a member of New Hampshire for Safe Technology for a few years and been involved with learning about radio frequency issues for longer than that. When I became aware of my own sensitivities and learned the science, which I think many people, when they learn the science, they start to see things very differently. Even though we love our technology and we want to use it every day, we need to use it safely. And I recently had a situation just last week where I wasn't using it safely, and I think I'm paying the price. I was grounding or earthing, which I think Cece will mention later, outside to try and help a inflammation in a sprained foot. And I ended up using my cell phone a bit outside, and I think the grounding and the cell phone together were a bad combination. So I feel like I'm having pins and needles and things like that. So I'm hoping it will go away. I think it will. But grounding's good, but after you use your cell phone, or before, but not during. But anyway, New Hampshire for Safe Technology, we aim to educate people, residents, people all over the country, legislators, and anyone interested in learning about wireless technology and safer solutions. We aim to help people in schools, in workplaces, in healthcare venues, anywhere where it can be helpful. And we hope that the New Hampshire Commission that studied the health and environmental effects of evolving 5G technology, that put out the report in November 2020. We still have hope that a lot of their recommendations will someday come to pass, and that can really help on these issues, because it's an amazing report. If you haven't looked at it, you should look it up. So I want to thank Deb Hodgson and Jen White, who basically keep New Hampshire for Safe Technology going, and also to Cece Doucette, who's here today and who's been doing our fabulous twice a month webinars for, I don't know, it must be more than 6 months now that we've been doing these, and continue to spread the word about how we can be safer with our technology, which really the stuff we use in our homes is the stuff that can make the most difference, even though we have a lot of limits on what we can do with the cell towers, even though we continue to try to do, help around that issue. So I want to let Cece introduce herself. It's with her amazing slideshow. Thank you, Cece.
Lori, thank you so much. We're so grateful you could be here with us today. And I understand you may have to leave a little bit early, so I'll take care of the Q&A at the end of our program today. So with that, I would like to share a set of slides that I've prepared, and we'll give that a second to load. Lori, can you see that on your end now?
Not yet, not yet. It says you started to screen share, but it hasn't. Oh, there it is.
Okay, good. All righty. So afterwards, in the coming days, we will send everybody who registered a copy of my slides, and anything in there with a blue underline is a direct link to the facts. So please feel free to dive in and research whatever resonates with you if you want to know a little bit more about it. So that MTPW after my name just means I had the privilege of earning a master's of technical and professional writing from Northeastern University. And I earned my bachelor's in communication studies, and never in a million years did I imagine that's what I would be using my skill set for today, to do technology safety training and education. So I'm very grateful that I can parlay that into work that I care passionately about. And the way I discovered that we have an issue with wireless radiation is I used to run the local education foundation in my town of Ashland, Massachusetts. And I spent years going about and running campaigns to bring all this wonderful technology into our schools, or at least what we thought was great technology. So I did campaigns to get wireless infrastructure, iPads, Chromebooks, smart boards, minis, Apple TVs, and all these other new technologies that we thought were going to help our kids. And then at book group one night, a girlfriend of mine who's an electrical engineer was reading the book by Anne Louise Gittleman called Zapped. And in Zapped, she was learning that wireless technology can be very harmful. So that's where my journey began. And it was book group, so I just kind of made a mental note. But not long after that, something else crossed my desk in writing, insinuating too that wireless was not safe. So I'm a technical and professional writer by trade. So I just said, wow, is there any science to back this up? And so I started looking, and you don't even have to look very far. There are literally thousands of studies all over the world showing great biological harm. And we'll go into some of those details in just a few minutes. So this was not an easy conversation to have with my schools. They had been told from the state level Department of Education that all of this technology had to be embedded into the curriculum. So when we raise the issue, they look at us like deer in the headlights, because this goes contrary to what they're being told from their higher ups. And if they get a poor review from the state, then that could impact their funding and their very jobs. So it was not an easy conversation to start, but thankfully members of our school committee started doing their own investigation. And ultimately we became the first in the nation to post this little sign that says best practices for mobile devices, to turn off these devices when we're not using them. Don't just leave them sitting around because they're pulsing radiation all the time unless they're off or fully in airplane mode. And then only turn the Wi-Fi on when needed. The industry would have us believe all Wi-Fi all the time is the way to go. So we sit there and we leave our routers on 24/7. We leave our wireless access points on 24/7. And after investigating, our schools recommended keep the devices off and only turn on the Wi-Fi when needed. And always place the mobile device on a solid surface. And we'll walk you through why that is in just a moment. And just like when I was a kid and I would be near the TV, my mom would always say, stand back from the TV. She knew then that even though we didn't have wireless radiation going, the man-made electric and magnetic fields that came off of the screen could be damaging to our eyes and our brains. So we became the first in the nation to even hang this little sign in our classrooms. Unfortunately, our schools are still today, 9 years later, waiting for higher authorities to tell them what to do. So I went to our legislators. Senator Karen Spilka and I had worked together alongside one another on this education foundation, and I had done all that fundraising for this equipment. So I met her for office hours and showed her what the science was saying, what our little sign in Ashland said, and I measured the radiation coming off of her cell phone and her district director's laptop, and both devices flew right off the charts into the red zone. And they're looking at me like, really? And I said, yes, Karen, and nobody knows. It's just like where we used to be with tobacco or alcohol or gambling or pornography and all these other, highly addictive substances. That's where we are with wireless tech. We need to at least give the public a right to know. So Senator Spilka put me with an attorney in her office, and together we carved out a very simple bill that would just ask the right minds to get together at the state level, look at the facts, and then determine what to do. And since then, we have had 20 bills filed in Massachusetts over the years that address things like forming a commission, protecting children from handheld devices, putting options in regarding utility smart meters. And we'll see that we have a few other bills this session too. We'll go over those in a minute. And then Deb Hodgson, who's another one of our wonderful members of New Hampshire for Safe Technology, she found out that we were doing a screening of an award-winning film called Generation Zapped. We'll tell you a little more about that later too, and we'll give you the links to it. But Generation Zapped, we were doing a screening at the River Valley Charter School here on the North Shore of Massachusetts. And Deb saw the invitation and came down from New Hampshire. And she had gotten very, very ill. Her doctors couldn't figure out, specialists couldn't figure it out. And she started researching her symptoms because there were so many symptoms, from heart to eyes to sleep to skin to nausea to vertigo to blood pressure, all seemingly unrelated. Once she started researching, she found the connection with man-made radio frequency electromagnetic fields. And that is the pulsation of microwave radiation that comes off of all of our wireless devices and all of the infrastructure we put into our communities and our homes. So Deb came with us and learned alongside, and she was just so gratified to be in a room full of people talking about this, because when you get sick from wireless radiation, it's a lonely journey if you're not fortunate enough to know how to connect with others who understand this issue. So Deb brought me up to do a screening at her library. And ultimately, we did a screening of Generation Zapped with her state legislators, Senator Tom Sherman and Representative Patrick Abrami at the middle school in Stratham, New Hampshire. And Deb received a knock on the door by her state rep, Pat Abrami, who was running to be reelected to the House. And she invited him into her home, taught him what had happened to her and how she traced it over to the wireless radiation. And this came as news to him because Rep. Abrami is an engineer, and our engineers have only been taught that you have to have heat from a device before it can cause biological harm. But Deb was shedding light on the science that says the FCC and the industry are allowed to put out radiation at levels way up here. But now we have a lot of science showing we have harm way, 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 way down here at hundreds of times lower than what the FCC is still allowing industry to pump out today. So Rep. Abrami's listening to this, and he was a really good public servant, and he went and he did his own investigation and had this major wow moment, like, wow, what are we doing with this wireless radiation? So Deb introduced me to Rep. Abrami. He started sketching out a bill and asked for my input on it, and I gave him some ideas. And then they got in his car from New Hampshire, drove down here to my home, and we sat around my kitchen table for an afternoon, and we helped him to connect the dots. And we'll show you a little bit later what that amazing bill was that he put forth in New Hampshire. So at Massachusetts for Safe Technology, and we'll give you links to that at the end of my presentation, but you can go into our resources page and you can see all the bills that I know about. I've got the Massachusetts bills, and I've got bills in other states. So feel free to see if anything's happened in your state, or if you know of bills that are current towards safe technology. We know the industry's got a ton of bills out there to railroad our states into letting them put toxic infrastructure at close range. But what I like to track are the ones that are actually helpful. So on this journey, I've had the privilege of connecting with many of the world's leading scientists and doctors and other experts on this issue. And we have built a nonprofit called Wireless Education, and we distill all this information into a little course that can be taken for about a half an hour online for less than the cost of a movie ticket. We still have overhead costs that we have to pay. So we do charge a small fee. I think it's about $15. But we have a schools and families course ready to go to train your entire school district, as well as your town or your company. We can give that training in about a half an hour online. I'm also now the co-founder of Massachusetts for Safe Technology. Dr. Deborah Davis of the Environmental Health Trust brought a panel of world-leading experts to our state house back in 2016 or 15. And up until that point, I'd been researching this for a couple of years on my own, and it was just amazing to go down to our own state house and be in a standing room only crowd of people who understood what this issue was, and then to have world-leading experts up at the podium talking about the science and the great need to have public policy catch up to the science. So from that meeting, I was able to connect with others around the state, and eventually we formed Massachusetts for Safe Technology. So I know we're so grateful to have friends from other states join us for these training webinars. And others have contacted me and said, hey, Cece, I really like what you did with your website. Can we just copy it? And I'm like, sure. I'm a big fan of not reinventing the wires. So if anything that we do inspires you and you want to borrow it, that's fine by me. Just let us know so that we have an eye out and can refer others to it. Somebody down at the National Institutes of Health found my work and asked me to co-chair the technology panel for the Health and Buildings Roundtable Conference down at the NIH. And I said, well, you know, I'm not a terminally degreed professional. I have a master's, but I don't have the PhD. And they said, that's okay. We just appreciate the way you share information. So I thought, sure, I'll come down. And we were very grateful to put together this expert panel. And I like to share this link because when we open this technology safety conversation and we start talking about the harms from wireless, most people may go, oh, tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist, right? And why wouldn't they? All they ever get through mainstream media is the industry's messaging. They don't get the balance of the harm and safe technology solutions. So I like to share this link down at the NIH because it's highly credible. I did the opening remarks, and then we had Frank Clegg, who's the retired president of Microsoft Canada. He was gracious to fly in and join our panel. And he spent 30 years in the industry, had no idea about the wireless until Dr. Magda Havas and others visited with him and measured his home and showed the radiation that he was saturated in with his family. And so he sought out a dozen of the world's leading experts all over and came back and declared that our FCC guidelines, Canada's Safety Code 6, are not safe for biological protection. So he has founded Canadians for Safe Technology, and we were just so grateful that Frank Clegg joined us. We also had Peter Sullivan, whose work I found through, I think, gosh, a YouTube video. And he was speaking in the autism community. He had gotten very sick himself. He had been a fighter pilot, kind of like Top Gun, where he's up there with the Earth's really high levels of natural radiation, plus being in a fighter plane that has all the man-made radiation mounted on it for radar, and then all the instrumentation inside the plane. And ultimately, Peter wound up working for Silicon Valley as an engineer, like his friends invented the cell phone and stuff. And his health started to crash. He dropped significant weight. His teeth started getting brittle, among other symptoms. And then when his sons came into the preschool years, both of his sons started presenting on the autism spectrum. And so Peter started doing what many parents will do. You clean out all the junk food and the commercially chemically grown foods in the diet, go to clean organics. And then he went so far as to do the heavy metal detox, because that can cause a lot of damage throughout our systems. Today, he will tell families as a first line of defense, do the digital detox, get the wireless radiation out of your home. And when I listened to Peter say that his two sons are grown young men now, 20s and 30s, I think by now, and neither one of them were on the autism spectrum anymore, I just went, whoa, I didn't even know that was an option. But apparently there's something called de novo mutations, which means it didn't come from mom's bloodline. It didn't come from dad's bloodline. It came from somewhere in the environment. So we don't want to overpromise because we know every single body is very different. But by removing these invisible wireless radiation exposures, there is an awful lot that can be done to improve people's health. So we also had at this conference, Theodora Scarato, who is the executive director of the Environmental Health Trust, which was founded by Dr. Deborah Davis, who's a Nobel Peace Prize co-laureate in climate change. And when she figured out what was going on with wireless, she has dedicated much of her life to this issue as well. Theodora helps to run the Environmental Health Trust, and she spoke on what other countries are already doing. She talks about countries that are removing wireless from the classrooms and elsewhere. And then lastly, we had Dr. Martin Paul, who's one of the world's leading scientists, and he goes through very quickly, biologically, the mechanisms of harm and what this constant bombardment of microwave radiation is doing to our biological cells. So the reason I especially like to share this link is all of our talks were under 10 minutes. So it's easily enough digested for somebody newly coming into the conversation. So feel free to share that. Now, one of the major gaps we had when I fell down the rabbit hole back in 2013, 2014, is that so many people were sick and suffering from electromagnetic illnesses, but how would they even know to connect it? They go to their doctors and they describe their symptoms. The doctors run the, tests that they know to run, but they've never been trained on microwave sicknesses. And so we are so very grateful that since then, we have had two major international medical conferences that are called the EMF Medical Conference. We'll use a number of terms interchangeably today. EMF stands for electromagnetic fields, and these are the pulsations of microwave radio frequency radiation that continuously come at us at millions and billions of cycles per second with man-made radiation. So we have this medical conference from 2021 that we were preparing this conference under the leadership of Elizabeth Kelly. And when the pandemic hit, we were no longer allowed to go out to Scottsdale, Arizona for this international conference. So we had to pivot and hire a company that could teach us how to deliver this conference through video. And so that's what we did. We pre-recorded all of the experts' lectures, and then we had live Q&A discussion panels. And there are videos still available for this. The conference just expired for 24.5 continuing medical education credits. That expired on July 1st. But Elizabeth Kelly tells us that she thinks she's going to be able to get the videos available again so that the training, even though we've missed the opportunity for the credits, the training will still be available. So we'll look forward to Libby's guidance on that in the coming months. So that's how I got involved. So what caused my schools to put that little sign up in our classrooms, right? How did we even get this far? I think it was when they read the legal fine print. So for anybody who's with us today, if you have an iPhone, I welcome you to take that out right now and go into settings. And I want to show you where that legal fine print is. If you don't have an iPhone, that's fine. It's in all of our devices. I just know how to get there through the iPhone. But our friends at Environmental Health Trust have this website called See the Fine Print, where they look at a number of different devices and show us what the legal disclaimers have been. Look at this one that was in there from the iPads: seizures, blackouts, eye strain. I know personally of children in my area who have had their first seizures while using the iPads. So anyway, from an iPhone, go into settings. It used to be, okay, so from settings, go a little ways down and hit general. And then it used to be on an old phone, you'd hit about and then go all the way down to legal and regulatory. And I liked that because people would remember the acronym GAL. Now it's just GUL. So from settings, you go to general, then legal and regulatory. And then on the next screen, about 4 down, you'll see RF exposure. That again is this radio frequency man-made energy, as they call it, that's actually two-way microwave radiation. And when we read that legal fine print, it tells us that this device was tested at a distance away from the body. So if we're tucking it in our bras, if we're putting it in our shirt pockets or our suit pockets or our yoga pants or our back pockets, or just simply holding it in our hands, we are exceeding the FCC's public radiation exposure limits. That's the Federal Communications Commission that's supposed to be protecting us. And as we'll learn a little bit later, they're not. They're protecting corporate profit instead of our health and safety. So it says right there, don't have this thing on your body. And then in a couple paragraphs later, it says if you want to reduce your exposure, use a speakerphone. So again, don't touch a radiating device or a headset. And I'm going to stop sharing my slides for just a moment or two to show you what a recommended headset would look like. One of the properties of wireless radiation is that it likes metal. Metal amplifies these man-made frequencies. And so if we have a traditional headset plugged into, let's say, our cell phone, and that wire is running up to our head, that is a direct pathway for that radiation to go right into your brain, which is a really bad idea. And again, we'll talk about the science in a minute. But for every problem we've created, we have solutions. And so for the headsets, you might want to look for something called a hollow tube or an air tube headset. And that's what it looks like. It's still got the little plug to go into your device. And then it goes up to here where you've got good volume control and muting. And then look at these little beads. These are called ferrite beads that break the radiation. And then the acoustics from there just travel up through a hollow tube, kind of like a doctor's stethoscope. And notice it's just rubber tubing. Even in the tips, there's no metal, because again, we don't want to draw metal even from the ambient radiation up into our brains. So look for a hollow tube or an air tube headset. The year I figured this one out, guess what my kids got in their Christmas stockings? Yeah, so solutions for everything. So when I figured out that there are devices that can help us see this invisible toxin, because if the pandemic taught us anything, we've got to be on our toes with invisible toxic exposures, right? So I learned that there are radio frequency radiation detection meters. When I pull this out, some people go, oh, you mean like a Geiger counter? And I'm like, yeah, but for the other kind of radiation. So the Geiger counter looks for ionizing radiation, which can break the atom. The man-made frequencies that we're dealing with are in the non-ionizing segment of something called the electromagnetic spectrum. So I want to show you what I've done in my house based on what I know. See how I'm in the green here and it's flashing? I don't know if the flash shows up on my camera, but green is as good as we can get. In the scientific literature, they want us to be at 10 or less on the maximum spikes of radiation. That's 10 microwatts per square meter. So, you know, in this much space, how much radiation is there? We want to be at 10 or less. So right now in my house, I'm at 2. Okay, but I want to give you a demonstration of what happens. I keep my cell phone in airplane mode as a rule, and I only turn it on for short periods of time when I need it. So I just turned it on, and we went from the flashing green way up into the flashing red, and I'm not even doing anything. This is the suite of antennas inside this one device that are pulsing, going, here I am, where are you? Here I am, where are you? To make or maintain a handshake with the nearest cell tower or router. So here I've got this right on top of my phone to simulate what it's like if you hold this in your hand or up against your head or tuck it in your body. So, oh mercy. Hang on, I'm going to go back into airplane mode. Okay, and watch, it dissipates after a few seconds as the radiation kind of pulses its way out. So we were at 2. Just by turning on my phone, that activated the cellular data antenna, the Wi-Fi, the locator, the hotspot, the Bluetooth, and if you didn't know any better and upgraded to a 5G device, there's an array of additional antennas, and each one is individually going, here I am, where are you? Here I am, where are you? So we went from 2 in my safe home to 1,000,090 on the middle number here, 1,090,090, and we want to be at 10 microwatts per square meter. So this is actually a device that's called the Safe and Sound Pro 2. It's put out by Safe Living Technologies, and it's a broadband RF meter that measures from 200 megahertz up to 8 gigahertz. This was recommended at the EMF Medical Conference to physicians and other healthcare practitioners to loan to their patients. And I've since met a doctor here on the North Shore of Massachusetts, Dr. Erin Acevedo. And Dr. Acevedo bought this meter. She loans it to her patients for $10 and says, now you've got 2 hours. Go home, do the scavenger hunt in your house, write down what's radiating and at what levels and come back. And then we'll talk you through how to remediate that. So a very practical device, and measuring is really critically important. Because with the Internet of Things and 5G, the industry is looking to put these antennas in just about every electronic device that we buy. So it's critically important to measure. And I want to go back to my screen share and show you what we did in my community. So when I discovered there are devices that help us see this invisible toxin, I thought, wow, our town has a pot of money through a grant fund that they distribute back out to the community. So I thought, let's get a grant for one of these meters for the schools and one for the library, so everybody can just gather their data and then start having choices in how they use their technology. So I thought that was a great idea. And I went to our board of selectmen and I presented my application, and they said, gee, we don't know about this, come back next time. So 6 months go by, I resubmit, and they, well, this is probably more of a Board of Health issue. But I had already met with our health agent, and he was around back in the 90s when the industry started pushing the cell towers in. And he said, we were literally wined and dined in big banquet halls and hotels where they were, just selling all the benefits of cell phones. And they were told, gee, if anybody has concerns about health, we're so sorry, but the 1996 Telecommunications Act says that if anybody has concerns about environmental exposures, gee, there's nothing that can be done because you can't sue us. And since then, some have come to interpret that environmental clause in there to also mean human health. So our health agent knew there was something up with cell phones and cell towers, but he hadn't made the connection that it's now all Wi-Fi. So I was like, well, gosh, the Board of Health really doesn't know this issue. So that's when I introduced legislation with Senator Spilka. And I recognized as I was meeting with the legislatures and presenting testimony to the Joint Committee on Public Health that they didn't know anything about this issue. And so I made it a priority to go into the State House and met with legislators and their legal leaders, their staff leaders, one by one. And all but one out of maybe hundreds that I met with, all but one, I would say, so please help me understand what you might know about the biological effects of today's wireless tech. All but one would say, gosh, until you brought it up, I really didn't even know there was an issue there. The one who said, I know a little bit, why don't you tell me what you came to tell me? After our conversation, he confided to me that his father was the physicist who brought the team into Chernobyl after it blew. He was from Russia, and he grew up knowing about man-made radiation, but every other legislator was completely in the dark. So I thought, wow, if I'm going to help my town, I guess I better meet one by one with my legislators or with my town leaders. So one by one, I went and asked for a meeting with each of the members of our select board. And I had a whole array of responses from that. One of them met me in my home. We had raised our daughters together. And then she went and told her daughters not to be putting the cell phone in their bras and stuff. Another one I met in a local restaurant, another one I went into his home, and two of the guys met me there, and I did a walkthrough and showed them the radiation in their home. And then I think the fifth one was a retired police officer, and he said, Cece, you had me at hello. He said, we have lost so many of our brethren in the force because we used to have our radar guns in the back of the cruisers. And so that radiation was beaming right through their brains, and a lot of them got the brain tumors. And then another friend whose husband was a police officer was telling me about the thigh tumors that the cops were getting from holding the radar gun on their laps. So because I went and I educated each one individually, and then I resubmitted my grant application, we became the first in the United States to be given a grant. It was a $400 grant to get one acoustimeter. This was back in 2016. They still were nervous about this, but they did give me funding to put one on loan in our public library conditionally, if our library agreed to take it into circulation. And the reason I even got the idea to put one on loan in our library is because when the energy industry started taking away our incandescent light bulbs and started promoting those swirly little CFL light bulbs, which by the way, throw off a really bad form of man-made energy in the extremely low levels of electromagnetic fields. It's dirty electricity. Those are really nasty. But anyway, when they were promoting those, they went into our libraries with a little kit that had a meter in it, thinking that we could borrow that meter from the library, take it home, measure our incandescent light bulb, measure a CFL light bulb, and see how much money we would save. It comes right back down to follow the dollar, right? So that's how I got the idea to even put a meter on loan in our public library. And that's something that all of you could choose to do in your libraries today too. This again was back in 2016. It was before the pandemic. It was before our library started a collection called the Library of Things. Today, a lot of libraries have amazing resources to loan out that are not books or DVDs or other traditional materials. Our library has a bicycle repair kit. It's got a projector you can borrow, all sorts of cool things. And now we have this acoustimeter on loan in our library. And at the first medical conference, I flew out to California for that one, and I met a doctor from Newton, Massachusetts, and she and I went after a grant from the state, from our cultural council, that allowed us to put one of these meters on loan and to do some programming around it. So we did a screening of Generation Zapped. And then out in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, Verizon came in and put a cell tower right on top of a neighborhood illegally. And they turned on 6 macro, which are the big antennas. They turned on 6 antennas on this cell tower the first week that all the children and their parents were locked down for the pandemic. So they're under this cell tower 24/7. 17 of the children and the adults got so sick, and they were working with their town. It's been 3 years now, and halfway through, their city council and mayor said to the Board of Health, you need to go in and investigate this. And for the first time in the United States, their Board of Health researched the science. They researched the doctors who had given diagnoses of electromagnetic illness, and they spoke to engineers, they spoke to the industry representatives, and somebody in Pittsfield went to their library and said, hey, it would be really great if we could put one of these devices on loan for the public to borrow. So that was just in the last year or two. So they went and put in this one that was recommended at the medical conference, the Safe and Sound Pro 2. So again, there is no knight in shining armor coming. There's no cavalry coming to fix this from the top down. Change is happening, but it's happening when citizens like you and I become informed and then start deploying the many resources that we're going to share with you today. So these are 2 ways that I have found are very effective at opening up the conversation, even with people who are skeptical, and who wouldn't be skeptical, because we've been kind of pushed into all Wi-Fi all the time, and we run our lives by it today. So expect that. That's the normal starting place. But you can just say, hey, you happen to have an iPhone? Let me show you something. Show them the legal fine print. And then it goes from tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist to, oh my gosh, it's right in my hand and it's telling me not to do this. And then if you have a meter in hand, you can show them how much radiation is coming off of their device. And that really is a very humbling way to motivate people to at least start considering that we might have a problem here. Okay, So now let's look at, before we move into the science, my local cable station has been so good to me over the years. They love creating community level content. And so I did a series of little public service announcements in their studio, like 2 to 5 minutes, just showcasing different areas that we'll cover today. And then they came into my house and I got to show what a typical household looks like today with all the wireless emission points. So we walk around and we look at, you know, the wireless mouse and the keyboard and the laptops and the printer and where the smart meter is, and, you know, all of the microwave oven, all these exposures that are invisible that we wouldn't even think about. Cordless phones. We give a walkthrough of my home so you can see what these are, and then we talk about solutions for how to start taking baby steps to change that. And then most recently, WCCA-TV is the station out in Worcester, Massachusetts, and Patricia Burke, who's been working on the smart meter and wireless issue for a very long time, has been invited to do programs with Mauro De Pasquale, who runs or manages that station. And she's brought me in a few times. And Mauro finally said, look, it's time to just have a series on tech safety. So very recently, we have started doing half-hour episodes a couple times a month. We've got 12 under our belt so far, and we bring in people from towns who are working on tech safety. We bring in doctors, we'll bring in other experts as time allows. So these, again, are just half-hour episodes that maybe you want to share with others to help make a point and maybe a launch point to start creating safety in your own environment and your own community. So the science, what are the long-term effects? For years, the industry played off cancer because cancer takes decades usually to surface. Now we're seeing it coming on faster because the dose of our exposures has greatly increased. So for years, the industry got away with saying, oh, you know, there's no mechanism of harm identified. The science is inconclusive. We need more studies. Well, back in 2011, we had enough science where the World Health Organization classified radio frequency electromagnetic fields as a group 2B possible human carcinogen. That's in the middle of 5 categories, right? So what was missing in 2011 were the animal studies. And now our own government, through the US National Toxicology Program, which is arguably the gold standard for toxics research in the world, concluded a decades-long study on cell phones. And they determined clear evidence of cancerous tumors and DNA damage, among other findings. Now, clear evidence is the highest of 5 categories they can assign. And the industry, when these good studies come out, will spin it and say, oh, that's just one study, you need more than one study. Well, right as we concluded our big study in the US, the Ramazzini Institute in Italy completed another multi-million-dollar study on cell tower base stations that, guess what, found the same thing that we found from the phones. It was also coming from the cell towers, the cancers, the DNA damage, and so on. So we don't need more science. What we need is good public policy and public education so we can still have amazing technology, but without the biological risk. So child and adult cancers and DNA damage, and DNA is the roadmap to grow a proper anything, be it a person or a plant or a biome or a tree, you know, all of it. When I started reading the infertility studies, I learned that they'd taken male human sperm and exposed it to a laptop with the antennas radiating. And it changed the DNA, it slowed the motility, and it caused far fewer sperm to be viable or apoptosis or programmed cell death in just 4 hours of exposure. And I went, you gotta be kidding me. I had just sent my oldest daughter up to college with her MacBook. My youngest had just gone into high school, and for Christmas, we gave her a laptop, and where are both my girls using their devices, but right on top of their reproductive organs. And since I was looking into this science back in, 2013, other major studies have come out with additional damaging evidence on infertility, including women, showing much higher miscarriage rates. Kaiser Permanente did a good study on that for women who are using wireless devices. And so many women will just set their device right on top of the bump, directly on top of their fetus in there. So we know better. And when we know better, we can do better. This neurotoxicity is something that I think so many can relate to today. Our levels of ADD, ADHD, autism, Alzheimer's are just going through the roof today. And Dr. Hugh Taylor down at Yale Medical, he heads up the OBGYN division at Yale Medical School. He's actually done some of the rodent studies on ADD and ADHD and saw that when he exposed the pregnant mice to these radio frequency radiation signals, the pups were born and came out bouncing off the walls a lot like a child with these neurological disorders. Dr. Martha Herbert founded the Autism Lab at Massachusetts General Hospital. She's a pediatric neurologist out of Harvard, and she sees huge connections between what the science is telling us happens to the brain when we get to this tipping point, that it spills over into autism for many. And then Alzheimer's, Dr. Martin Pall, whom I mentioned earlier at our conference down at the NIH, he has culled the science on Alzheimer's and brain deterioration. And he is reporting now that we are seeing earlier and earlier onset of Alzheimer's, just like with cancers that used to come after many, many years. Alzheimer's used to hit in our 70s and 80s and beyond. Now we're seeing it in people in their 60s, in their 50s, in their 40s, in their 30s, and even in some cases to people in their 20s. So we cannot continue to pollute the environment of the brain and not expect that we're going to have problems. And if you watch Generation Zapped, you'll hear talking about what happens. Dr. Palpatcher and others over the years have done tests to show that this constant pulsation of microwaves is permeating or opening up this wonderful membrane we have around our brain called the blood-brain barrier that keeps toxins, as your body does regular cell repair and regeneration, all that garbage gets escorted out of the body through the blood. And we have this beautiful blood-brain barrier to protect those toxins from going into our brains. Now the science shows that this bombardment of microwave radiation is opening that blood-brain barrier. So now toxins can get in to where they never used to go. So to just kind of give you some numbers around what those pulsations are, the Earth, there's a Dr. Schumann who figured this out, and we now call this concept Schumann's resonance. It tells us how the Earth resonates its own healing electromagnetic field. It pulses at 7.83 times per second. We get this lovely healing energy from the Earth. And what have we done? We've gotten so fancy with our man-made frequencies. In the megahertz range, that's 1 million times per second. Boom, 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 boom. We're getting jackhammered with this man-made spike of erratic microwave radiation. And now we're moving up into the gigahertz range, especially for 5G. That's 1 billion times per second. Our cells are getting jackhammered with microwave radiation. And we wonder why. It'd be the bigger surprise would be, why aren't we falling apart? So because mainstream media is primarily owned by the companies that own the wireless industry, we don't hear this very often in mainstream media. So we're very grateful when better known groups get funding to be able to start presenting information on this. And the Environmental Working Group is one of those groups. As a mom, I had learned about the good work they've done around pesticides, and every year they put out something called the Clean 15 and the Dirty Dozen, these two lists that say if you can buy organic, you better get these foods organic, because the pesticides that are used to grow conventional foods are really, really toxic on these particular, dirty dozen. Then they put out their clean 15 list that says, because of the skins or however this produce is grown, you can probably get away with buying it conventionally with minimal pesticide exposure. So I've known about EWG for decades, and they also have recommendations around personal hygiene and home care products. And so now they've gotten funding, and they are doing active reporting and putting out bulletins on what this radiation is doing to us and to our children. So they have a fact sheet here called Protecting Kids from Wireless Radiation in Schools and at Home. And they've also done another one here on the central nervous system, or the neurotoxicity that we've discussed. So again, know your audience. If you're going to open up this conversation, it's always great to have something in hand that you can leave them with, so that they can credibly understand that this is a real issue and we're not just making it up. And then we need to know that children are not just little adults. Their very systems are still biologically under development. Their DNA is still forming, their central nervous system, their immune system, and they are especially vulnerable to any kind of intoxicant, including microwave radiation. So Dr. Om Gandhi and his colleagues did this modeling here that shows these head models turned sideways, with the little yellow dot is the ear, to show that when an adult puts a cell phone up to the ear, we're penetrating our brain with microwave radiation about a third of the way through. On a 10-year-old, that's literally going into their brain about 3/4 of the way. And here on a little 5-year-old, you see that it's going almost all the way into a child's brain. And we know scientifically that's because a child's skull is still forming, so it's not as thick as yours and mine. And their brain has a higher water content, which, exacerbates the molecules and all that fun stuff. So wireless devices are not toys for children. We need to protect the children. If ever you give a device to a child, make sure you've turned off all the antennas, and whatever they're using is downloaded right onto the device, and then they can use it safely. Although screens are not good for the eyes, so be very judicious about ever giving a child a screen. And if you do, at least make sure it's not radiating. So that's some of the effects from the long-term science. The short-term effects, a lot of people will recognize once we simply help them to connect the dots that it could be the emissions from their wireless technology. And we should also recognize that for decades, the Americans with Disabilities Act has long since recognized electromagnetic sensitivities, and they even go so far as to recommend what accommodations should be made in the workforce and elsewhere. So what are these effects? Insomnia is one that so many relate to today. Adults, adolescents, children, so many do not sleep right anymore. And we know scientifically now why that is. And again, the industry has spun this up. Oh, there's no mechanism of harm identified, so let's just keep doing what we're doing. Well, we talked about the cancers, we talked about the infertility, we talked about the blood-brain barrier. So we have learned a lot about the mechanisms of harm. With insomnia, and you'll see some articles that talk about give yourself an hour or two without screens before bedtime, because that blue light can dysregulate the melatonin, and we need melatonin to regulate our sleep cycle with our circadian rhythm. Well, that's all true. But what we also need to know is that these microwave radiation frequencies pulsating at us all night are an invisible light energy form. Our brain operates, our circadian rhythm operates off of the natural light cycle. So in the wee hours of darkness, our pineal gland releases melatonin. Melatonin goes in and regulates sleep and helps to escort the toxins out through the bloodstream. Our brains can't differentiate between this man-made light energy form that's pulsing, and natural daylight. So when we're supposed to be sleeping and all this is pulsing, the brain thinks the lights are on. and in many cases doesn't properly release the melatonin to go in and regulate our own bodies. So insomnia is a huge one. Headaches, nosebleeds, ear bleeds, fatigue, chronic fatigue, just feeling wiped out. So as Dr. Andrew Goldworthy shared with me from the UK, he said one of the other dirty little secrets the industry would prefer we don't know is that our biological cells only have so much energy, and they are very well calibrated to get us through our normal day and to do the cell repair and regeneration while we sleep. When we have this constant pulsation of microwave radiation, our cells are over there trying to do cell repair and regeneration and keep our cells together. But eventually we get to a tipping point and we get to this domino effect and start seeing a whole wackadoodle range of all different symptoms depending on our own individual proclivities. So it's no wonder that if we don't get this radiation under control, we often get to a tipping point and start getting sick. Pain from unidentified sources, these stabbing, searing headaches, skin abnormalities. It turns out that we have little antennas in the surface of our skin that help us to navigate our way through our world. And they are very susceptible to these microwaves. And so we have skin. Some people will talk about the hot ear from holding a cell phone up to their head. I know a family where a cell tower went up at a school and the kids all of a sudden started getting these full body rashes. Gentleman who did our wonderful logo with Massachusetts for Safe Technology, Chuck, he figured it out because his leg was going jiggity and his doctors couldn't figure out what was going on with the nerves. He did his research and found out that his leg was going jiggity because that's where he kept his cell phone and it was doing nerve damage to his leg. Heartbeats that go too fast or too slow, depending on what your own body does. Cognitive impairment where we just can't think. Anger and behavior issues. So this really just caused my heart to sink at the EMF medical conferences. The doctors were telling us if we don't stop radiating ourselves and our children, we can expect to see many more of these societal outbreaks like the mass shootings that have been increasing because it is biologically changing the gray matter and the white matter of the brain. And then even before the pandemic, we were at epidemic levels of anxiety, depression, and seeing suicidal ideation among kids, let alone adults, like we have never seen before. And this is just one example of a good article you can share. It's in the Journal of Chemical Neuroanatomy by Dr. Martin Paul called Microwave Frequency Electromagnetic Fields Produce Widespread Neuropsychiatric Effects, including depression. And he culls a lot of the science that's been up to that date. So it's not just you and I, it's every living cell on the planet. And we have amazing resources to share with you on that too through this link. This will take you to my personal research repository where I've got different pages on all these different subjects. So you can see the planetary effect. But we know it's not just the neonicotinoids and other chemicals in the environment that are taking out our pollinators. We are radiating them to death. The birds, when they were doing 5G testing in The Hague in the Netherlands, there were reports of birds just literally dropping out of the sky, either dead or stunned, when these microwaves started increasing in the air. And then energy consumption. There's a Greenpeace analyst who in 2012, so well over a decade ago, said if the cloud were a country, it would be the 5th largest consumer of energy in the world. That's what we're doing with our tech. And that was before we even got into all these new layers of technology and 5G and the Internet of Things, where they want billions of devices connected all the time. So as fun and sexy as all this technology is, we really need to take a giant step backward and say what makes sense, what's good for us, what's good for our planet and for the economy. And then you don't even want to know about the human atrocities that are going on to get the dozens of minerals that go into every single one of our electronic devices down in the Congo with children and villages that are just, yeah, it's not good. Katie Singer has some good information that's available at that link. So data warehouses, networks, our own personal devices, streaming, sending and receiving, charging and recharging, and all these dozens and dozens of apps we've been talked into that we probably rarely use, that are constantly using energy to do their updates in the background. Once we know better, we can choose to do better and start eliminating all the things that we don't use all the time, and then learning to use the things that we do use all the time much more safely. So when I was down that rabbit hole and I'm learning all of this and it's all just so evident, I'm thinking, well, why don't we know? And that's when I was very gratified in 2015 when Harvard Law School Center for Ethics came out with this amazing report called Captured Agency: How the Federal Communications Commission is dominated by the industries it presumably regulates. And that was my missing puzzle piece. Look at this graphic that they use here. It's a revolving door. And that's what our federal agencies have become: revolving doors with industry. People from industry are now running the FCC, the FDA, the CDC, the EPA, and others. There are still some really good public servants up there, but by and large, many of our critical agencies are now run by industry to protect their interests, not you and I. And that was in 2015. That's free and online. More recently, last November, ProPublica came out with this article echoing the same findings and bringing it current, how the FCC shields the cell phone companies from safety concerns. And as our friends at Americans for Responsible Technology have discovered, there are huge conflicts of interest with the FDA. And when we look into the background of the gentleman who's in charge of the FDA with the radiation component today, that's Dr. Jeffrey Shuren. So he wasn't around 20 years ago when the FDA commissioned this study to see if cell phones were safe, but he's in charge today. And he was in charge when they determined this $30 million study determined clear evidence of cancers and DNA damage. That should have triggered public policy. But apparently Dr. Shuren went over to his friends at the FCC and said, keep doing what you're doing, nothing to look at here. We don't really believe that report. And one might ask, what would ever possess Dr. Shuren to do that? Well, go look into his background a little bit. You'll see that his wife is a partner in a law firm that represents the wireless industry and other big environmental polluters. So sadly, these conflicts of interest go all the way up to the World Health Organization. I was sitting in a meeting with the Dover-Sherborne High School, their Committee on Health and Wellness, and that's the town next door. And as I'm presenting the facts, one of the guys at the table was on his iPad and he starts fact checking me. And, you know, you will pull up things at the World Health Organization at a cursory search that say, oh, it's inconclusive, there's no real evidence. And when you look at the dates on that, they're old. And how would you even know that the World Health Organization, because the US and Italy have determined that this causes cancer, they've reopened their investigation into this. And now they're calling for not only investigating cancer, infertility, the environmental impacts, the impact of children, the electromagnetically sensitive, but you're hard pressed to find that online because the corruption runs so deep. Even at the World Health Organization, there are two groups. One of them is basically industry appointed, and the other is the actual highly qualified scientists who are trying to say, we've got a major problem here. So this corruption goes all the way to the top of the house. There have been scientific appeals sent to the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and all of their member states. So our scientists are trying, but industry is so powerful. So that's why we don't know. So that's when I realized there is nobody above protecting us, that's when I decided to get really busy on this. And I am so grateful to the many, many, many experts who are working on this long before I came along, and the many who have joined the conversation since and are working from where they are to get to safe technology. So what does safe technology look like? Let's talk first about the devices that might be under our own personal control. If you look at your router and flip it around or pick it up and look at the bottom, you'll find there are Ethernet ports installed right in there. All you need to do is get a big long Ethernet cable and run it to wherever you use technology in your house or your office. And by today, most people use more than one device. So there's something called an Ethernet switch. Think of it as an extension box for electronics. So you'd plug one cable from the router into the Ethernet switch, and then you get little cables and adapters for each one of your devices and plug those in. And the beauty is every port on here gives you a direct connection to the internet. So you're not competing for like the wireless, bandwidth that a lot of people are struggling with today, because wireless is really, really poor quality technology. It's fast for the industry to install. It's highly profitable, but it's terrible technology as far as speed, reliability, energy consumption, and sustainability go. So get Ethernet cables. If you may surprise yourself and have a box of them somewhere in your house already. I did down in my basement, and I pulled that out and was grateful because we could just quickly hook things back up in our house and start turning off the antennas one by one. But if you buy new Ethernet cables, look for something that on the cable says shielded. All that means is there's a aluminum foil liner around the wires inside the plastic. And there's another low-level form of dirty electricity that can come off the wires through the electric field and the magnetic field. And that can permeate your living environment by 6 to 8 feet from the walls or from the wires. So if you can get a shielded cable, it's just a little upcharge of a few dollars. And then you can get these little adapters to phones, to tablets, to laptops. Once you plug everything in, and if you're not on the go, this is meant to be mobile technology when you're outside and going somewhere. When you're not on the go, you can simply forward your cell phone to your landline. And I know a lot of people got talked into giving up their landlines. But if you look at the payment schedule with your internet service provider, in my case, it was no different whether I used internet through wireless or through cables, and then whether I used a cell phone or whether I used a landline. It all came out to about the same price. So re-engage your landline if you can and forward your cell phone calls. There's something in the settings that allows you to forward it to a landline. And then you go in and you turn off all the antennas in all your devices and in your router. Now, step 1 is you hardwire. Step 2 is you turn off the antennas. And step 3 is measure. And I learned this the hard way. So I thought I had everything cleaned up in my house. I eat a pretty clean organic diet. I get a pretty good night's sleep. So come Monday morning, I'm sitting in my office, and all of a sudden I've been in here in an hour or two, and I'm like, why does it feel like the earth is sucking me down again? I was losing my energy. And so I pulled out my meter and I turned it on, and it started going up into the red zone. So I start swiping my space, and it was my printer. My daughter had been home over the weekend, and she was teaching swim lessons in our pool and wanted to print out her schedule. She said, Mom, can I just turn on the Wi-Fi real quick and print my schedule? I said, yeah, just make sure you turn it off. So on the faceplate of my printer is a little glow light with the Wi-Fi logo on that shines if the Wi-Fi is on, but it wasn't shining. But with my meter, I could tell it was radiating severely. And so I just went online and looked up the manual for my make and model. And lo and behold, that printer had 3 antennas in it, and only one was connected to that faceplate. So I just went into the settings and found all 3 antennas and turned each one of them off. And then I measured again, and I was back into the safe green zone. So like I said, with the Internet of Things, they want to put these transmitters, one or more, in all of the devices that you buy today. My husband bought a new stove, and it came in and it had smart technology. And when my girlfriend built a new house, I looked at her stove and measured, and it was radiating. And so we could go into her settings and find the RF exposure setting and just turn it off. But with my stove, there was no setting that I could access. And so I pulled out the manual, and I was, mind you, my house is always under 10 if I can help it. My stove was measuring over 1 million. So I look up the fine print in my manual, and it says stay, I think it was like 20 centimeters away from the radiating antenna, which is like 7 or 8 inches. It's telling me to stand away from my stove. I'm like, what? How am I supposed to cook my food standing in the middle of my kitchen instead of at the stove? So I thought that was kind of funny. So I called tech support and said, I need some help figuring out how to turn off this antenna. And they didn't know what I was talking about, but they sent a technician to my house, and I showed him that normally my house is 10 on my meter. The stove was at 1 million plus, and he was grumpy. He's like, I don't want to know that. I'm just here to do my job, but he didn't know what to do. So he called his tech support, and I said, I can show you what your phone is radiating. And he got really grumpy with me. He says, fine, I'll go wait out in my van. So he comes back and he takes off the back panel of the stove, and next to the motherboard behind the digital display, there is this little tiny board hooked into the motherboard. And all he had to do was unplug that RF antenna. And then he just tied it up neatly and put the back on the stove. And I measured, and I was back into the safe zone. So he was very gracious, though. He thanked me. He said, I learned something today. And he said, and honestly, I would never buy a smart appliance. I said, well, where do you get a non-smart appliance? Because Lowe's and Home Depot, they've only got the latest, and they're all radiating. He says, no, I just go online and I find them. I find ones that are, what today would be considered low end. And he said, that's what I buy. So I thought, okay, well, thank you for that. So this is how we can hardwire our own space, and measuring is critically important. I know that Lori went in with her neighbors and they all split the cost of one. The one that I have from the medical conference is about $400, but there's a little sister one that's about $200. It may not be quite as sensitive, and it may not give the digital readout, which I like to use when I'm teaching, but there are other lower cost points. And then of course there are professional meters in the thousands. So see what you can do to measure it, because if you don't, you can't guarantee you're in a safe area. So that's what you and I can control to a degree. Let's talk about 3 areas that you may or may not have control over. When I was a little kid, I'm one of 10 kids. And so we did a lot of hide and seek outside. And I would hide in the bushes and keep myself occupied and watch the little dials go around on the utility meters for gas, water, electric. And now today we have solar. And Lori mentioned her propane tank outside. They had installed an RF meter on that too, to get remote readings on when the tank goes low or malfunctions. So all of our utility meters today, we need to start looking at. If it has an FCC ID number somewhere on, this data that's on the front of it, if it has a digital display or it has an FCC ID number, that's your clue that it's pulsing radiation, usually continuously. That's bad enough, because even though it might be mounted outside, a lot of times they're mounted in basements. They could be in an apartment complex or a condo complex with a whole bank of them, indoors or outdoors. And as we discussed, radiation amplifies with metal. And in many cases, we see that this radio frequency can hop on the house wires or pipes and travel all throughout your walls, virtually turning your house into a giant RF radiating antenna. There's also far too many reports of like a power surge that can spark something inside these meters that can cause a fire or an explosion, or if they're not properly grounded, we can get into trouble there. And then there's all these additional issues about constantly sharing our data on what we're using in our house and sending that off to third-party vendors who buy our data and then want to sell us, you know, whatever their products are. So these are big data harvesting and privacy issues. Others are also concerned about what governments might be doing with our information. But at the EMF medical conference, the doctors were telling us that when these smart meters go on, if we don't know any better and we wind up being positioned right next to the wall where these things are pulsating, we see that this can cause sudden onset microwave sicknesses, you know, all those symptoms we looked at with the not sleeping, the anxiety, the depression, the headaches, the nosebleeds, the nausea, the brain damage, the cognitive impairment. And then this has turned out to be yet another big environmental justice issue where these toxic industries roll into town and say, oh, hey, we've got this great program. We're going to give you all these financial incentives. And isn't this great? They'll do a pilot like they did in Worcester, Massachusetts with National Grid, and then say, hey, New York, hey, Rhode Island, hey, Connecticut, look how successful it was in Massachusetts. You guys should adopt this now too. Well, in reality, this was all put in with no informed consent. People were getting sick. It was affecting the pollinators and, you know, everything else in the area. And they went way over budget. National Grid did. And our Attorney General's office got engaged because National Grid wanted to turn around and charge the ratepayers for this big budget that they blew through. So these smart meters can be a nightmare on many levels. What they should do is hardwire them to the premises and put laws around the data security and privacy and not use any kind of radio frequency. Jeremy Johnson is a Silicon Valley engineer, and he and his medical doctor wife both suddenly became very sick, and nothing in her training could help them understand what was going on. And when they did their research, they pinpointed it into the bank of smart meters that went in on their condo. So Jeremy does a really great TEDx talk in about 15 minutes that you might find helpful to give to people in your world who are engineers or physicists or, you know, technologists. He can talk to them techie to techie in this one. And it's really good for the general public too. Dr. Alexia McKnight had a smart meter put on her home, and she got really sick and didn't know why, to the point where when she was out in traffic, she couldn't piece together in her brain whether a green light meant stop or go. And this is a medical doctor. She's a veterinarian radiologist. So she works with radiation all the time, and they have tons of precautions they put in place around the ionizing radiation. And she had no idea what the non-ionizing radiation was doing. But her smart meter malfunctioned, and they took it off the house, and lo and behold, within days, her symptoms all started going away. And then they replaced the smart meter, and then something else happened where they had to turn it off or take it off again. And lo and behold, all her symptoms went away. So this is how she figured out what was causing the damage. So she's done a TEDx talk too. So great resources for you there. Some towns offer an opt-out, so it's worthwhile to check in with your town and see if you can get an opt-out. And hopefully no fee, because it's kind of extortion to charge a tariff or a tax to just simply have a public utility meter on your home. So smart meters. Now let's look at the cell towers. They started coming in as these big macro cell towers that were mounted in industrial parks far, far away from where we lived and worked and played and worshiped and studied. And then they started encroaching in, you know, hey, aesthetically, if we can paint it the same color as your building, well, hey, we can just slap them up on the roof or the side of the building. And so it's become a nightmare to have these encroaching in closer and closer and closer to be able to keep up with the capacity demands as they sell us more and more and more wireless technology gadgets. So it's really important to examine the non-industry funded science on cell towers, because again, using the big tobacco playbook, the industry will do their own studies that are designed to show no harm or to say, hey, it's inconclusive, let's just keep doing what we're doing. So we've pulled together the non-industry funded science, and being a tech writer, I just created a very simple research repository called Understanding EMFs, because I didn't understand what electromagnetic fields were. So I have a page here on cell towers, right? This is my nav with all different categories of information. But in the science, they are telling us that we need to be at least 500 meters from these cell towers. That's 1,640 feet. So there's a neurotoxicity and a death curve that starts to come down at this 500 meter or 1,640 foot mark, starts to come down at that level. It doesn't actually catch up with a normal population statistics for these neurotoxic symptoms and death until double that at about 1,000 meters or 3,000 some odd feet. So we should never, ever have allowed these cell towers in at close range. But you can go in and look at the science for yourself and share that. And then here in the US, we have something called antennasearch.com. And if you type in any address, it will give you a return of the number of these big macro cell towers and antennas within a 3-mile range. So there might be a couple hundred around 3 miles of where I am. When I put in the number for the State House in Boston, there were 1,520 cell towers. And when you count up all the antennas, 4,512 within a 3-mile radius of our State House. So downtown Boston and downtown most of our major cities are just so electro-polluted right now. And that's all these dots densified in Boston. And this is what just one neighborhood, a residential neighborhood in Boston looks like. So it's unconscionable what the industry has done, knowing the science exists. So those are the big cell towers. That's what our 3G and 4G signals have traveled on for a long time, and 2G and 1G, but they're repurposing a lot of those older signals to bundle them up into what they're calling 5G. 5G is defined differently by every carrier. It's kind of a marketing term, a catch-all phrase. So now we add the 5G small cells, and 5G just means 5th generation technology. It came after the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Sounds innocuous enough, but it's an entirely new layer of microwave radiation. The way the industry is positioning it is they're spinning it up that we're going to have faster entertainment downloads. You'll be able to get your movies in a split second or 12, whatever. Smart cities, super highways. But that benefits them. It's no good for us, and it's no good for our communities. And if you look to see who's buying up the entertainment industry, guess what? It's the telecom industry and their parent companies, the wireless industry. So as they're selling us all these great new entertainment venues, they're also pushing all this backbone infrastructure into our neighborhoods at close range. And so one of the properties of these 5G waves is the 3G and 4G waves are long, and they can pulsate into indoor spaces. But all that's left to monetize are these dinky little millimeter waves. And they promise that these little waves can carry vast quantities of data, but they get dysregulated or knocked out by rain, by snow, by leaves, by trees. And so 5G can't fly on its own. It's got to be bundled up with the existing longer wavelengths. So now we've got a ton of new man-made energy pulsating at us as they start putting in these 5G small cell antennas. So this right here is a map of how they just decimated Boston with all these additional installations of small cell antennas at close range, literally at bedroom height, like 30 feet off the ground, right outside bedrooms, buildings, offices, schools. And they, to fill their capacity, as they keep pushing more and more, they need more and more capacity. They want to put millions of these small cell towers in at the curb right outside where we live and work and play and study. And we get report after report of them coming in, sometimes even under the cover of darkness overnight, and just decimating the trees so that they can get their signals through. And here in Boston, we now have the mayor saying, we've got a big project going on to rebuild the tree canopies in our communities. So if anybody with us today is from Boston, reach out, and it takes a constituent to open the conversation, but I would love to join you to educate Mayor Wu on the damage that these small cells are doing, and it's contraindicative of what they want to do with their new tree canopies to keep our cities cool in the summertime. And here's the kicker. Senator Richard Blumenthal was at a congressional hearing with the Commerce Committee in DC, and he had 2 industry representatives there, and he asked them to please share, how much money have you invested in independent testing of this new 5G technology before it came to market? And the guys kind of hemmed and hawed, and then ultimately were made to say, we don't actually know of any independent science that's been done on this. So in this 4-minute clip that Environmental Health Trust provided to us, it shows Senator Richard Blumenthal saying, so basically we're flying blind here as far as health and safety is concerned. And that's what they do. They push these toxic solutions in without ever making sure it's safe. And Computer World and others who track, the speeds of, what they're saying, all this great speed, fast technology, they're saying 5G is a bad joke. It's not even turning out to be any faster than what we had with 4G. And there goes Verizon last year touting that, oh, wow, we've now brought 5G to 100 million in the US. And then I just want to put a mention here. There was a lot of bad publicity around 5G and the pandemic, where people were saying 5G caused the pandemic. And, what we need to remember to do is don't listen to mainstream media. Come back and look at the science. This paper by Dr. Beverly Rubik and Dr. Rob Brown was very rigorously peer-reviewed before it was allowed to be published. And it shows evidence for a connection between coronavirus, COVID-19, and exposure to radio frequency radiation from wireless communication, including 5G. And basically what they did is they were able to run the statistics to show that where 5G systems went live, there were higher incidents of COVID cases and COVID death rates. And knowing what we know about our biological cells, if you've got this radiation pulsing at close range 24/7, it's no wonder that people got sicker there than where they hadn't yet put in 5G installations. So just follow the science. But when I talked about 5G one time, it completely turned my state representative off, Representative Jack Lewis. And I met him at the farmer's market. And I said, Jack, what caused you to do an about face? He says, well, you started talking about 5G and COVID. I said, but Jack, did you look at the science? The science indicates that where we have high radiation, our bodies can't keep up with all the cell repair. And then you add a layer onto it like a virus, and people start getting sick. It's not rocket science to figure out. So I was grateful that he let me send that science off to him. But just know, if you mention COVID, a lot of people are going to be turned off until they have an opportunity to look at the science. So I wanted to mention a really great program that Dr. Magda Havas has launched. It's called the Global EMF Monitoring Project. And she retired from Trent University up in Canada, where she taught electromagnetic radiation effects for 25 years or so. And she recognizes that our countries, by and large, have dropped the ball on radio frequency, and very few are actually out there measuring what are we exposing ourselves to. So she is engaging people like you and I, who she'll call citizen scientists, and anybody who has the Safe and Sound Pro 2 meter can volunteer to participate as a citizen scientist. She's got protocols for you to use on, get a clipboard, print out her protocols, And the first one she did was to have us go into our main town, the main road, and go down 4 or 5 intersections and measure the radio frequency. And she's got a little protocol where you do a 4-point turn to measure from all directions at each intersection. And then we just enter that data into her database. And she's doing this worldwide. So people all over the world are participating in entering their data so that you can say, hey, can we brag about our town? So that's the nickname of her project, is can you brag? Because B stands for black, where the radiation is so very high. R is for red, for danger. A is for amber. We're getting into the alert area here. And G is for green. And we talked about indoors. We want to be at 10 microwatts per square meter. That's what this looks like scientifically, microwatts per square meter. Indoors, we want to be at 10 or less. There was a convention held in Salzburg many years ago where they talked about, well, provided you're not just standing there under a radiating tower, what could we get away with if we could go home and have a safe, clean environment to do regular cell repair and regeneration? So they came up with a guideline in Salzburg of 1,000 or less microwatts per square meter to stay in the green outdoors. So what do some, oh, I wanted to mention back here, if you go to globalemf.net and you decide you want to become a citizen scientist and own your own, Safe and Sound Pro 2 meter, if you reach out to them and let them know that through their contact page, our friends at Safe Living Technologies have offered them a discount code. I think it's a $400 meter. I think I might have paid like $308 for mine. So if you want to participate, then please, you can have the benefit of that discount. I think they're still offering it. But we want to be at 1,000 or less. At the Westmoreland, New Hampshire Fire Department, they're in that range. In Keene, and again, these measures were taken during the pandemic where there weren't a ton of people driving by with all their equipment blaring or people walking around on the streets. Keene was already in the amber, and we just recently learned that they've started putting small cells in at the curb inside neighborhoods in Keene. And there's a good group of citizens working on that. If you want to connect with that, just let me know. Nashua and Concord, New Hampshire, all in the red. And then Stratham, New Hampshire, where Representative Patrick Abrami and Deb live, we did measurements on their main road, and they had put a big cell tower up right on the main strip, and that is in the blackout zone. And then look at the north end of Boston. See this signpost for Hanover Street? That's the main tourist area where all of our amazing Italian restaurants and bakeries are in Boston. And look at this pretty wrought iron lamppost that turns out to be a pretty wrought iron cell tower. These are the 4G and 5G antennas inside here at street level. And look, there are residential homes right above all of these storefronts on the first floor. So it's unconscionable what the industry has done. And they came in and said, oh, it's no big deal. You'll get some money for putting it in the public access way. We'll make it look real pretty. And then when you go down Hanover Street and you look down the crossroads, you see these ugly gray monopoles that they stuck up. They didn't even put the pretty ones everywhere. So again, follow the dollar. They want to do it as cheaply and quickly as they can before they're made to stop. So how do we stop this? Martin Luther King Jr. taught us that when important societal change happens, it comes through 3 channels. 1, the public becomes informed and decides to get engaged because nobody else is going to fix this for you. 2, it eventually gets pulled into the courts. And 3, public policy catches up to, in this case, the science and starts protecting you and I and our pollinators and everything else. So I'll spend a few minutes going through some really great inroads that are happening in each of these areas. And then again, as I said, we'll leave you with my slides in a day or two, and you can go drill through and learn more on your own. But I'll give you the high-level overview. So legal solutions. Remember that $30 million study that we did that found cancers and DNA damage here in the US and Italy? That should have triggered public policy, but Jeffrey Shuren went over to the FCC and said, keep doing what you're doing. And so there had been a case opened at the FCC. It was public docket 1384. And for years, like 6 years, all the science went in from experts all over the world, medical advisories, you know, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Academy of Environmental Medicine, and all these groups who recognize that wireless radiation is bad. So all this science, medicine, and testimonies from, you know, thousands of people have become sick from this, all in the public record. And when Dr. Shuren came to the FCC and said, maybe let's just keep doing what we've been doing, they closed that public record and made their finding and recommendation, and they filed it into something called the Federal Register. Once the FCC said, we're not going to change our public exposure limits that were set up in 1996, that have nothing to do with the way we're exposed today, they said, we're not going to change it. Then the lawsuits could begin. So the Environmental Health Trust, Children's Health Defense, and a number of other groups and individuals from around the country all sued the FCC, and it all got bundled into one court case with the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C. And, you know, the industry lawyers are in there, the FCC lawyers are in there saying, oh, it's all well within the FCC limits, it's all fine. Meanwhile, the folks who sued worked their tails off in culling all the information in the public record, and they presented these 3 judges with 11,000 pages of evidence of harm from the public record, 27 big fat binders. So the judges are reading through the binders and they say to the FCC, where's your homework that says this is still safe to expose at those levels from 1996? And the FCC went, well, the FDA said it was okay. So the court's asking, well, where's the FDA's homework? Well, not one of our federal agencies has ever done the scientific review. We have a huge regulatory gap, as the Environmental Health Trust would tell us. So the FCC got sued and won. And it was actually on Friday, the 13th of August in 2021, where the courts remanded it back to the FCC. Our courts don't like to step on federal agencies and tell them what to do. So they sent it back to the agency and said, you need to account for all these effects that we're seeing in the scientific literature. Next month, that'll be 2 years, and the FCC has done nothing to respond to that court order. And the Environmental Health Trust has filed a document with the courts. The Children's Health Defense has filed a petition with the courts saying, look, they've had their time. Let's make them do what you guys told them to do. So all that is in place. So that bodes really well. But again, the courts and public policy take years to come full circle. But there are other lawsuits that have happened. There's a petition you could go sign with Americans for Responsible Technology to make the FDA declare this is an imminent hazard and they have to step up and protect the public. When I mentioned that Verizon put up that cell tower in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, right on top of a neighborhood that made 17 adults and children so sick that they've had to abandon their home. For the first time in the United States, their Board of Health did the deep dive, and you can read the cease and desist order that they issued to Verizon. And along the same time, we discovered that the state level Massachusetts Board of Health legal guidelines now include 4 pages about cell towers in there. And we're hoping that it's been a few years now we've discovered that that's been in there. And we're hoping they'll come out with a new version soon that brings it even more up to date with this victory with the Environmental Health Trust and Children's Health Defense. So this cease and desist order is a really good document for you to look at. I think it's only 24 pages, but they document the science and the biological harm. They document that doctors are giving diagnoses of electromagnetic illness when these cell towers come in. And they document insights from engineers who understand this technology and know that we should have setbacks. You should never put a cell tower or a small cell or a smart meter right on top of a home. And importantly, they also listen to the industry that brought in one of their so-called experts by the name of Dr. Eric Swanson, and he's a PhD physicist out of Pittsburgh. And they listened to Dr. Swanson, and then they fact-checked Dr. Swanson, who's saying, oh, you can put your head inside of a microwave oven, you know, it's fine, yada, yada. Well, they looked at his background. He has nothing to do with electromagnetic fields of radio frequency radiation. He's a physicist who specializes in quarks and other physics properties. He's never published one study on EMFs. And this is who the industry parades around as their expert. So we're very grateful that the Pittsfield Board of Health documented his lack of credibility in their cease and desist order or emergency order to Verizon. They gave Verizon 7 days to come to the table. And there's actually a commercial property owner in Pittsfield who's nowhere near a residential area and said, hey, we don't care. Verizon can come put their cell tower here. They'd still give coverage where they want coverage, and we wouldn't be radiating anybody. So there are solutions. The Board of Health asked Verizon to come to the table. Verizon instead, at the 11th hour, went to the courts and asked for an injunction against the Pittsfield Board of Health, because the Board of Health had already consulted with the state level agency for health boards and discovered that it looks like, although the Telecom Act from 1996 says you can't deny us from putting in cell towers based on certain criteria, all that applies only to the siting of the cell tower. What the Board of Health discovered is once something comes into the community, if it's a nuisance or a toxicant, it is the Board of Health's jurisdiction now. It's their duty and responsibility legally to get that toxin out of there. So for the first time, there is a court case now, and the judge has looked at the initial filing and has agreed that this case should go to trial. So initially, the Pittsfield Board of Health had looked to see how much it would take to trial, and there were two pathways that all told were like $80-something thousand. So they went to their city council and their mayor and said, you know, we'd like to request this funding, and their mayor wouldn't give it to them. It looks like Mayor Linda Tyre and their city solicitor, Pagnotta, both have conflicts of interest with the industry, and certain members of their city council may have too, although some have been very good on this issue. But they refused to give their own Board of Health, whom they told to investigate this issue, refused to give them the finances needed to take this to court. So now the citizens have sued the city of Pittsfield, the mayor, Pagnotta, the city council, and unfortunately they have to sue the Board of Health in this too, and the Board of Health understands. So now the courts have just approved that this lawsuit can move forward, and they are putting together the administrative record now to show all the ways in which Pittsfield knew. They were informed time and again that this was harmful, and they dropped the ball on protecting their citizens and environment. So we're excited to watch this play out. We're so grateful to Children's Health Defense for helping the citizens in Pittsfield with this lawsuit. So hopefully by the end of this year, we may know more. So there are many, many lawsuits that have been happening, but again, we don't hear them through mainstream media because the industry owns mainstream media. So leading policy solutions, that work that was done in New Hampshire was groundbreaking. Rep. Abrami's bill asked, why have Lloyd's of London, Swiss Re, AM Best, and others long since recognized this radiation as a world-leading risk, and they do not cover for damages? So that puts our towns at legal risk, our schools at legal risk for damages when there's harm. We talked about the fine print, the FCC ignoring all the science, and nobody looking at the cumulative effect, like in a classroom where you've got 20 or 30 of these devices radiating from every point in the classroom, plus the ceiling, plus the hallways, plus cell towers that the industry is forcing into our schools and saying, hey, school, you'll get a revenue stream if you just let us put the cell tower there, and hey, everybody will get better signal. Our schools don't know any better. Our towns don't know any better until you and I bring information like this forward. So it took less than a year to get a law passed in New Hampshire. We've had bills in Massachusetts for 10 years, and we've still not passed anything meaningful to tell the public to be careful. In 7 months, we got a law passed in New Hampshire that resulted in this amazing report that's available in my signature on any of my emails from New Hampshire, and they document the conflicts of interest with the wireless industry, the FCC, the FDA. They asked them to come talk to this formal legislative council, and our federal agencies refused. They then make 15 recommendations to get our federal delegates on this and start working at the federal level to change these laws with the EPA, with the FCC, with the FDA, get our federal agencies to do their jobs on this. They have recommendations to label everything in the community at eye level. So if you're near a cell tower or one of these pretty small cells or an ugly small cell, you know that this is radiation and it's dangerous. They have recommendations to transition our schools, our libraries away from wireless and simply go back to using safe, hardwired technology through Ethernet cables and adapters to our devices. It's not rocket science to fix. So he had an amazing bill. We got the commission formed. He led the commission. And a year later, even during the pandemic, they stuck to their deadline and they came out with this report. So then that means, and Dr. Kent Chamberlain from the University of New Hampshire, he was the chair and professor of computer and electrical engineering. He thought this would be a slam dunk. Of course, Wi-Fi's fine, right? Until he was elected to sit on that commission and then started reading the science. And he's done a complete about face. And so he's done this 20-minute presentation about this bill and the commission's findings, and you can look at his slides to substantiate everything. So last year, there was a bill to try and get setbacks in place. It was a bipartisan bill, and it would also establish a registry of harm because nobody's gathering data on how many people are getting sick on this. But the industry got in and torpedoed that one. But one of the nice pieces of testimony that came in among many other good testimonies is Frank Clegg from Microsoft Canada. In his testimony, he indicates wireless is no longer advanced technology. It's outlived its useful life as a main source of connectivity. We should be bringing fiber optics, high-speed cable to the premises and then connecting with wires indoors and getting rid of all those wireless antennas. Keep cell towers at a distance. They can travel for miles for emergencies and stuff, but let's train the public how to use technology safely. So they didn't pass that bill, but they did take a vote and agree that something should be introduced this year to start addressing this. So we did another bill to give the local towns control to say if or where they want these cell towers coming in. And the industry got in there and torpedoed that one. But right as that one failed, Representative Tracy Quint, who's a nurse and a legislator up in Maine, she was hearing from her own adult children and from constituents that there's great reason to be concerned. And so she's introduced a bill to do an investigation like New Hampshire did to protect the birds, the bees, the insects, and children. Connecticut had a bill this session that didn't get very far, but at least it's raising the awareness on small cells and smart meters. And then we've got a half a dozen bills here in Massachusetts, and there are more around the country that you can look at as well. So feel free to peruse those. And one of the things the industry does when they come in and they start putting in their applications and saying, hey, we're going to give your town a revenue stream. And if anybody raises issues, it's just the NIMBYs, the people who just don't want a cell tower in their backyard. And nobody else is talking about this. So we'll just go about our way and put this in. Well, they tell our towns that nobody else cares, which is simply untrue. If you go to Americans for Responsible Technology, you will see that there are more than 150 groups already established all over the country. So you might be able to find a group where you are by clicking here, and this will take you to their website where they also have a toolkit for how to start a group if there's nobody near you. But you can take a look and look through what's happening in Massachusetts with cell towers. You can look at Massachusetts towns that are taking action on this. And there are public servants taking action all over the country. There's a grandmother in Easton, Connecticut who figured it out. They had a doctor on one of their local boards, and they looked at the science, and they actually put a moratorium on 5G in Easton, Connecticut until it can be proven safe. And they re-upped that moratorium recently. Hawaii County did a resolution to talk about banning 5G, and things like this are happening all over the world. So please feel empowered to go look at this until you have the courage to start this conversation where you are. A moment about our schools. So the industry came in at the state level and started forcing in their 21st century classroom. Their goal was to put a one-to-one device in the hands of all of our children, and the pandemic provided that perfect opportunity for them. Silicon Valley executives, meanwhile, there was a 3-part expose done by the New York Times that shows that they are banning screens from their children. Not just Wi-Fi, but screens, because they know a child's brain does not develop properly in the shallows of a screen. And in fact, there was some good news out of Europe where the Netherlands and Finland have recently announced that in the coming school year, screens are banned, except for medical and disability, and having a devoted lab where you're learning digital skills. They're banning screens, cell phones, tablets, smartwatches, all of it has to go. They know that children are being damaged in their learning processes by screen time. So there's a lot of encouraging work on that, but Silicon Valley execs are sending their kids to schools where there is no technology. And they're going so far as to having their nannies sign contracts that there will be no screens around their children while they push this toxic technology at our kids. Our friends Patty and Doug Wood at Grassroots Environmental Education, they have the Americans for Responsible Technology Project. They've also launched Tech Safe Schools. They will, if you send them a list of the administrators in your school and maybe the town attorney and others, they have a program set up where they will send out a packet of information to the people you give to them. And their website talks about the health effects, the legal risks, and most importantly, how to remediate. So they've got a great program with Tech Safe Schools. And then experts have worked with the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition, which has now come out with K through 12 curriculum for every grade level about screen time and preventative measures. And then Dr. Alexia McKnight invited me in with her to do a professional development day in her children's schools in Philadelphia. And we did 4 sessions throughout the day and taught all the teachers who attended what the risks are and how to actually start taking steps towards safe technology. So the video of one of those presentations is there if you want to share it with your own schools. And then here's our little course for wireless education. And then Environmental Health Trust has a ton of postcards and flyers and information sheets that you can use for many different purposes as you help educate others. Theodora and others in Maryland have helped Maryland become the first state-level agency to recommend hardwiring technology in schools. So this is a great fact sheet to share with your state and schools. Dr. Tony Stein from the U.S. Collaborative worked with the U.S. Collaborative for High Performance Schools and got a module in there for low EMF best practices. And this collaborative does green school certification. So most of our schools are looking at how to be greener. And even if we just come in talking about energy consumption, it's a great idea to address these EMF best practices. And other countries are already putting out guidelines for studying at home during the pandemic, hardwire the technology, create distance if something is radiating, and they have minute guidelines by age for what's appropriate for children to be in front of a screen, and not a phone because that's really damaging to the eyes, but a full-size screen, limited quantities. So lots of great solutions. The Dr. Panagopoulos in Greece has worked with colleagues all over the world, and they have just come out with the first medical school textbook on EMFs. Physicians for Safe Technology is an excellent resource for your own healthcare teams, because until we bring it to our doctors, nurses, firefighters, first responders, most of them have no idea that they need to be careful with this technology. And then there are additional really good resources for other professions as well. And for you and I, if you're not a do-it-yourselfer, hire an electrician and just tell them you want Ethernet cables in all the rooms, Ethernet connections, and then just turn off the antennas in your devices in the router. If you would like to bring in a professional to scan your entire house for all sorts of environmental exposures like water quality, mold, VOCs, formaldehyde, and EMFs, you can hire a consultant through the Building Biology Institute. And here's this award-winning film, Generation Zapped. It's a great way to just bring people together in your living room, your own family members, your mature children, the parents of the kids that your kids hang out with, grandparents. Just start the conversation. And Generation Zapped is now available through Amazon Prime, and many of our libraries now have it in their streaming collections. PBS has done 2 episodes, thanks to Camilla Reese and Dr. Erica Valerie Blythe out of the UK. And here's that toolkit from Americans for Responsible Technology to help you start the conversation where you are. And then just stop and think a minute. Monkey see, monkey do is what we teach our children. So if they see us nose down in our devices all the time, we've just given them permission to do exactly what we're doing. So it's hard, so much of our lives is going through our cell phones or whatever. So it's critically important to start thinking about setting limits for yourself and your children and model those good behaviors. Lori talked about how she got injured again recently by earthing or grounding while she was holding a radiating device, which kind of probably built her own biology into the circuitry and caused some damage. But without a device in hand, we all should be connected to the Earth's healing energy. Remember, we're calibrated at 7.3 natural hertz per cycle or per second. We're getting pulsated at millions and billions of times with our man-made tech. So The Earth Prescription is a lovely book. I had read Clint Ober's first book on grounding, and it taught me all the science, but from a practical standpoint, I'm thinking, well, look, I live here in the Northeast now. We can't go out and walk barefoot 6 months out of the year here. So Dr. Laura Conover, who's a medical doctor, she came up with a book, poor thing, just as the pandemic hit, but it's called The Earth Prescription. And she takes us through all 4 seasons and teaches us how we can ground naturally, even if it is, freezing cold outside. A couple of the little hacks I learned is if you've got a pet that's on the grass or on cement, not on blacktop, that has a petroleum product that seals off the Earth's energy, but cement is just sand and water basically, so it still transmits the electrons. But if you have a pet that's on the ground and you pet their snout or their ears, the less furry areas, you are instantly grounded, and that helps to regulate your own bioelectrical circuitry. Or if you're walking along, I got myself a fingerless pair of gloves for winter. It's got the little flap to stay warm, but I can undo the flap and just touch the leaves and the pine needles as I go by. Anything that's got the higher water content. You don't want the bark of the tree because that's insulating the energy into the tree, but touch the higher water content of our natural environment and you are instantly grounded. So lots of wonderful ways and things to learn. I love that book. And then Huffington Post put out this poster at one point called 50 Ways to Take a Break, because so many have fallen down with their noses into the screens or their thumbs up their phones. And we just don't do what we used to do with all the wonderful hours of our day. So here's a nice reminder if you want to take a closer look at these 50 ways to take a break, to get outside, less screen, more green, as our colleague, Dr. Carrie Crofton in Canada guides us. Less screen, more green. Get back into music, get back into poetry and writing and journaling and reading and tell jokes with people and get out and dance and, go check in on your neighbors, go for a nature walk, all these wonderful things that make us healthy, happy human beings. Okay. And here are some items you can take into your community with you. I just want to mention ALARA, the Centers for Disease Control for Ionizing Radiation, already has a three-pronged approach with radiation. As low as reasonably achievable is the goal. And you get there by spending as little amount of time in radiation as you can. You create as much distance from a radiating emission as you can. And third, if you can't get away, you should do your best to shield it, and always hire a professional to do shielding because there's some pitfalls there. But these are incredible resources to help you open the conversation with your town. And, don't kid yourself. There's no safe level of man-made radiation in the scientific literature. So we really need to get away from it. But invite people back to these sessions. Come back yourself time and again, learn a little bit more, come back again, learn some more. But we can be brought in to do public education forums in your towns. We can do it with your schools. Think about where you are, what you do for work, what your professional associations might be. They're always looking for public speakers, and I would be honored to be brought in. So let's get our towns moving on this. Tell your town, don't be afraid to engage an attorney who specializes in this. Most of our town attorneys are good doobies, but they are way out of their depth when it comes up against the telecom industry. So you can hire somebody like Andrew Campanelli. He can look at your zoning code. I think he charges like $8,500 to look at your state's laws, to look at your own town zoning code, and to help you fill the gaps and bring them up as strong as they can be. Because the industry tells our towns, your hands are tied, there's nothing you can do, which is simply not true. Congress empowered our towns to protect themselves, but our towns don't know. So get a good lawyer and get it figured out. So for today, start noticing what's radiating. Be gentle with yourself. Start with baby steps, create a sleep sanctuary, and then migrate to Ethernet cables and adapters. Keep everything in airplane mode as often as you can. And look at these great resources that Environmental Health Trust and others have. Okay, so thank you for listening with us for 2 hours today. I'm going to go ahead and stop the screen share. And I invite anybody who would like to raise their hand with questions or comments. I'll go ahead and put us in gallery mode.
This is
Yes.
Deb. I'm here, and I was
Hey.
monitoring the chat because I know Lori had to step out.
Yeah.
And there were a few questions, and then Lenore had a request she'd like to speak, and she did have some questions herself. But first, Mark asked what you just spoke about. What would you recommend about developing an EMF safety training program in one's local school? How can we get administration to agree to having such a program? And is this even a good idea?
It's a fantastic idea, Mark. But I know you have a medical background and you know how hard this conversation is to have with people. What I would recommend is that you start doing Generation Zap screenings and get the parents engaged, right? Because that was my hard lesson learned. Everyone congratulated me for getting this little sign in Ashland, but it's just a sign. They are still radiating the children in Ashland Public Schools and the staff. So if I had a do-over, I would get everybody around me educated first, all of the parents and all of the grandparents first, and get a strong group of parents, and then peaceably go in and start presenting information to the schools. And it may come down to legal action, but hopefully, as we get them educated, we might be able to have some important progress. And, when we can show that the Netherlands and Finland and other countries are already protecting the kids, and the FCC got sued, so we can't rely on their expertise anymore. Today's a new day, and if I can be brought in to help do these education webinars, this is my happy place. So I hope that helps, and let me know if you want to reach out to me directly.
Okay, Peggy had a question. What kind of stove did you get? Gas, electric, or induction?
I have a gas stove because I just like to cook on gas. If you go out to the Building Biology Institute, they have some fact sheets available, and I just noticed they have one on those induction stoves. My understanding is that they can create a lot of dirty electricity, and it might pollute the wiring of your home as well as your kitchen. So I wouldn't choose one.
Okay, Erin had a question. Are the EMF conference videos still available?
They are not today, but we think that they are going to become available again in the future. Libby Kelly, as the executive director of that conference, she just helped to put together another big conference that was done over in the UK. And she's busy getting all of that conference wrap up post work done now. And then she'll turn her attention back to the EMF medical conference videos.
All right, and Lenore had 3 questions about what was the remedy for the autistic boys, and can you spell out? She had Rebecca Browning, and then what article should we share? And then she would like a chance to speak. So
okay, I think Lenore might have dropped off already. But shoot, what was the first question, Deb?
the first one was, can you spell out? Sometimes when you speak, if it's not a link, she said Rebecca Browning.
Oh, I think she might have meant Beverly Rubik.
Yeah.
And Rob Brown. Those are the 2 doctors who did the COVID paper, and that link is included in my slides, which I know you'll be sending out soon.
And she said, please spell out the remedy for the formerly autistic boys.
The remedy was to remove the wireless radiation exposure in the home. And if you go to Massachusetts for Safe Technology and look on our events page, one of the building biologists joined us for one of these webinars a few months back. And Eric told the story of how he was inside a family's house, and he starts by turning off all the electricity in the house. And I think there was a 22-year-old autistic young man in the home who didn't know that Eric was in there. And when Eric shut off the power to the house, this young man came out of the back bedroom and said, "What just happened? The pressure in my head is gone." And he was feeling all of these man-made electromagnetic fields, and it was just horrible for him. So Eric has said in one home, it was the pool pump that was putting a lot of dirty electricity onto the wiring. And that was remediated and caused a lot of, improvement in health. So you figure out the dirty electricity, you figure out the wireless, and in many cases, we do see great improvement. So we have a little excerpt of Eric telling his story there on our events page.
All right, and Peggy would like to ask a question.
Sure, Peg, go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, hi, Cece.
Hi.
Regarding the stove, I have a gas stove now, but I've been reading so much about the toxic fumes that come out of gas stoves. So you're not worried about that, or you don't think it's really that terrible?
I haven't done the research on that, Peggy, and I have used a gas stove my whole life. I don't know. I know we want to get away from gas as an energy source. So it's hard because for every man-made solution we come up with, there's a dark side to it. And so I guess you just have to do your research and know your own body and know what you think you might be able to handle.
Yeah, I personally love gas stoves functionality-wise. They're instant and you can see they're on, but I wasn't even researching. I just kept getting little bullets of information about, the fumes, keep your windows open. So that's why I was going to get rid of my gas stove, and then I was going to get an induction stove. And then I looked more into that, and it says it can emit, radiation just by nature of its, it's magnetic.
Design. Yeah.
And then what's the guy's name in California? The
Jeremy Johnson.
Yeah, Jeremy. I wrote to him, and he said, yeah, you should really stay away from the induction. So I canceled the order for that. And I'm ready to go back to grandma's style with the old coil top. So anyway.
Yeah,
I love
it's
gas.
hard. And these industries sell these great energy efficient things without doing or disclosing the dark side, right? So good for you, Peggy, for doing your research on all of this. It's always nice to have you back with us.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, Deb, any other?
No, there was just, before Lenore left, she had said, thank you, Cece. My town is ready and interested in presentations. Let's talk. So,
Awesome.
Yep.
She has been working so hard. And I will
Yeah.
say Lenore is a senior citizen. She lives in senior housing and she was injured by the radio frequency coming out of the control system in the basement, as well as her neighbor's, I think, decked cordless phone maybe. So she's been working really hard with the building authorities there, the housing authorities, and trying to educate her neighbors. So again, this isn't where any of us ever imagined we'd be spending our time, but we're so grateful when people decide this is just not acceptable, and then we can help them with resources and training to try and get us to the right direction. Okay. Deb, thank you so much for coming back on with us.
oh, sure.
For everybody who joined us, we look forward to sending out the video and my slides in the coming days. And as ever, feel free to share these sessions because we're doing it for you. We want to just keep spreading the word and hoping that tonight somebody might get a better night's sleep. All right, everybody, have a safe afternoon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.